The moment I saw my brother's name on that envelope, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Not metaphorically. I actually grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter because my knees went soft and the room did something strange, like the walls breathed in and didn't breathe back out. The late October light was coming through the bay window of Grandma Ruth's kitchen, the one that faced the old pecan orchard, and everything looked exactly the same as it always had: the blue and white checkered curtains, the ceramic rooster on the shelf, the faint smell of whatever she'd last baked still living in the walls. Everything the same. Except she was gone, and now I understood what she'd tried to tell me. I just didn't understand it yet. My grandmother was not a woman who needed anyone to speak for her. She'd built Heller Creek Farm from 40 acres of leased red clay soil in central Virginia into a 212-acre working operation with a farmhouse, a restored barn, a pottery studio, and a commercial kitchen that had supplied 3 regional restaurants for over a decade. She did it mostly alone. My grandfather died when my mother was 9 years old, and Grandma Ruth just kept going, the way she kept going through everything quietly, with her jaw set and her hands already moving toward whatever needed doing next. She used to say that the land didn't care about your feelings. It only cared whether you showed up. I showed up. That's the part of this story that matters. And I want to say it plainly before everything else, not because I want credit, but because it's the reason any of what happened later happened at all. I showed up, and my brother Marcus didn't. And that difference, which seemed small for a long time and then suddenly seemed like everything, is what Grandma Ruth saw more clearly than anyone. I'm Claire. I'm 31 years old. I was a licensed occupational therapist working at a rehabilitation center in Charlottesville when all of this began, which means I spent my days helping people relearn how to hold a fork, how to button a shirt, how to move through a world that had become suddenly unfamiliar to them after illness or injury. I was good at patience. I was good at showing up on hard days and not making it feel like a sacrifice. I learned that from her. Marcus is 4 years older than me. He went to business school in Chicago, married a woman named Petra who wore linen blazers even at family dinners, and came home to Heller Creek approximately 3 times a year: Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, and Grandma Ruth's birthday in June, where he would stand in the kitchen doorway with a bottle of nice wine and talk about his firm's portfolio while she stood at the stove and stirred something that had been simmering for 2 hours. She was always polite to him. Grandma Ruth was polite to everyone. But I knew the way you know things in families, in the space between what people say and what they actually do, that she saw him clearly. She saw me clearly too. That was the part that felt like a gift I hadn't earned. When she was diagnosed with the vascular condition 3 years before she died, I started driving out to Heller Creek on weekends. At first, it was just to help mowing the back field, driving her to appointments in Roanoke, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings when her legs ached, and she didn't want to be alone, but also didn't want to make a fuss about it. Then it became something else. It became the best part of my week. She taught me how to read soil, how to know when the winter wheat needed another week before turning, how to talk to the women at the farmer's market, not to sell, exactly, but to connect, to make them feel that what they were buying had a history and a person behind it. She said the pottery studio was her real language, the thing she'd been saying her whole life in the only form she could say it. She let me work beside her out there on Saturday mornings, both of us quiet and clay-covered and completely at peace. I never asked to inherit the farm. I want to be honest about that. I never thought about it, or tried to think about it, because thinking about it felt like imagining a world where she was gone, and I wasn't ready for that world for a very long time. When she passed in February, it was a Tuesday morning, and I had driven out the night before because her caregiver had called and said her breathing had changed. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, and she didn't say anything grand or final. She squeezed my fingers twice and looked toward the window, and then she was gone. The pecan trees were bare. The frost had come early that year. I called Marcus from the driveway. He said he'd catch a flight in the morning. The attorney's name was Mr. Alderton, and he practiced out of a small office in the town of Culpeper, in a building that had been a hardware store at some point and still had the original pressed tin ceiling. He had handled Grandma Ruth's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. He was the kind of man who wore the same quality of suit every day and never seemed hurried. He scheduled the will reading for 10 days after the funeral. Marcus and Petra drove down from Dulles. They arrived at the farmhouse the morning before the reading, and I watched Petra walk through the rooms with a look that I can only describe as inventory, her eyes moving along the shelves, pausing on the pottery pieces, touching the edge of the dining table the way you might touch something you're deciding whether to keep. Marcus stood in the front room and looked out at the orchard and said it was a shame about the drainage issue in the south field. I hadn't told him about any drainage issue. He'd looked it up. He'd been doing research. That night I lay in my old bedroom under the quilt Grandma Ruth had made for me when I turned 16, a double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams, and I stared at the ceiling and told myself that whatever the will said was what she wanted. And what she wanted was right. And I would be okay. I believed that. I want to be clear. I genuinely believed it, and I was genuinely prepared for whatever came. I just didn't know what was coming. Mr. Alderton's office had 4 chairs arranged facing his desk, and a window behind him that looked out onto Main Street. Marcus sat to my left with Petra beside him. I sat on the right. Mr. Alderton set a folder on the desk and folded his hands on top of it. He said Grandma Ruth had been a thorough and thoughtful woman in all things, and that her estate documents reflected that care. He said she had last updated her will 14 months before her death, which everyone in the room already knew because Marcus had apparently confirmed this with Mr. Alderton's office the previous week. I found that out later. At the time, I just noticed that Marcus seemed settled, already arranged in his chair with the posture of a man awaiting confirmation of something he considered decided. Mr. Alderton opened the folder and began to read. The farm, the land, the buildings, the equipment, the commercial kitchen license, the farmer's market contracts, the pottery studio, and all its contents went to Marcus. The house contents were divided. A cash bequest went to the local library, which Grandma Ruth had volunteered at for 30 years. Her jewelry, her personal papers, and a specific box in the cedar closet upstairs were left to me. Marcus let out a breath like a man setting down something heavy. Petra touched his arm. I looked at the wall behind Mr. Alderton's head and thought about the pressed tin ceiling and how long it must have taken to put it up. Mr. Alderton cleared his throat. He turned the page. He said, "There is a secondary instrument attached to this will, a conditional codicil, executed on the same date, witnessed separately. I want to make sure everyone present is aware of its terms." Marcus said, "What codicil?" Mr. Alderton looked at him over the top of his glasses for exactly 1 second, and then he began to read again. Grandma Ruth had written the codicil in her own words, which Mr. Alderton had then formalized with proper legal language, but you could still hear her in it. The precision of her, the way she said exactly what she meant, and nothing extra. The codicil stated that the bequest of the farm property to Marcus Heller was contingent on a single condition, that within 90 days of the will entering probate, Marcus would demonstrate active operational management of the property, defined as physical presence on site for a minimum of 30 days within that window, and documented engagement with the existing farm accounts, suppliers, and the farmers market cooperative. If that condition was not met for any reason, the farm property would transfer entirely to me. There was a silence in the room that felt like weather. Marcus said, "That's not, she didn't tell me about any condition." Mr. Alderton said, "The codicil is legally executed and witnessed. Your grandmother was quite deliberate about its inclusion." Petra said, "Can it be contested?" Mr. Alderton said, calmly, that it could be reviewed by another attorney if they wished, but that it was his professional assessment that it was sound. Marcus turned to look at me, and I saw something move across his face that I didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't just surprise. It was the look of a person recalculating a story they thought they already knew the ending to. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I was still trying to understand what had just happened, not the legal mechanics of it, but the other thing, the thing beneath the thing. She had planned this. She had thought it through. She had sat across from Mr. Alderton 14 months ago and said, "Let's see what he does." The drive back to the farmhouse was quiet. Marcus rode with Petra in their rental. I drove alone and stopped at the pull-off near the creek where Grandma Ruth used to take me when I was small, and I sat there for a while with the engine off and listened to the water. I thought about what she'd told me once. The summer I was 26 and going through something hard that I'm not going to get into here, something that had made me feel like the ground under my life was less solid than I'd always believed. I had driven to Heller Creek on a Sunday and sat at her kitchen table, and she had put a cup of coffee in front of me, and then sat down across from me and looked at me for a long time before she spoke. She said, "The people who only show up for the harvest don't know what the field cost." I hadn't fully understood it then. I think I do now. Marcus called me that evening. He was composed, the way he was always composed when he was managing something, his voice measured, his sentences short. He said he thought we should talk about a practical arrangement. He said the condition was achievable, that he could restructure some things at work and be present on the property. He said he had ideas about the farm's next phase, he used that phrase. Next phase that involved modernizing the commercial kitchen and potentially pivoting the pottery studio space toward event hosting. I listened without saying much. He said, "You understand this isn't personal, Claire. This is an estate. This is a business asset." I thought about Grandma Ruth's hands. The way they looked after a morning in the studio, gray with dried clay up to the wrists, and always, when she washed them, the small smile she gave like she'd done something worth doing. I said I understood. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the following weeks, Marcus did come to the farm. He came 4 days in the first week and 2 days in the second, and he walked the property with a notepad and made calls from the front porch and had a conversation with the farmers market cooperative coordinator that apparently did not go well because she called me afterward to ask if everything was okay. Petra came once and spent most of the visit photographing the barn interior. The women from the pottery cooperative, 6 of them, who had been using the studio every Thursday for 3 years, paying a modest fee that Grandma Ruth had reinvested straight back into materials, called me to ask about scheduling for the spring session. I told them I'd get back to them. I watched all of this from a careful distance. I had taken a step back from the day-to-day operations at the farm, partly because it was now legally Marcus's responsibility, and partly because I needed to know, would he do it? Could he become someone who showed up not just for the documents but for the actual work of it? By the end of week 4, he had logged 14 on-site days. He needed 30. The suppliers had received calls from him but no confirmed orders. The cooperative paperwork was sitting on the kitchen table unsigned. I was not tracking this to build a case. I was tracking it because I couldn't stop watching. The same way you can't stop watching a storm come in over a flat field even when there's nothing you can do about it. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 58 days into the 90-day window. It was Marcus. He said he'd had a conversation with his firm's managing partner, and there was a situation in the Chicago office that required his attention, and he needed to return by the end of the week. He said, "I'm not going to make the 30 days. I've got 14 left to go and I can't be away from the office for another 2 weeks right now." There was a pause. He said, "I wanted to tell you directly. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't transfer to you. I think we both know what happens now." I sat down on the edge of the porch steps. The pecans were starting to come in. I could smell the soil the way it smells in October, like something that has been working all year and is finally exhaling. I said, "Marcus?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm sorry it went this way." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She knew, didn't she? She knew exactly what I'd do." I didn't answer because I thought the answer was obvious, and because I didn't want it to feel like something I'd won. The farm transferred to me legally 11 days later. Mr. Alderton called to confirm the condition had not been met and to explain the next steps. He said Grandma Ruth had also left a letter in the cedar box and that she had asked him to mention it when the codicil outcome was known. I went upstairs and opened the cedar closet. The box was medium-sized, wooden, with a small brass clasp. I had seen it on that shelf my entire life and never opened it, because it was clearly one of those things you don't open until you're supposed to. Inside, there was a stack of photographs, me and her at the farmer's market, me in the studio at maybe 27, covered in clay and laughing at something off camera, her standing in the south field in her work boots with her hands on her hips looking at something I couldn't see in the frame. There was the deed to the farm, original copy, and a small envelope sealed with her wax stamp, the one she used on pottery orders, a simple letter H inside a circle. Inside the envelope was a single card. Her handwriting. It said, "You never asked for this. That's the whole reason it's yours. The land knows who showed up. So do I. Take care of the Thursday women. Take care of the pecans. Take care of yourself first, because you've never been good at that part. All my love, Grandma Ruth." I sat on the floor of the cedar closet for a long time, not crying, exactly, or not only crying. Something else. The feeling of being seen so completely by someone that it doesn't even feel like a surprise. Just a recognition. Like finding a letter you wrote to yourself years ago and discovering that the person who wrote it knew you better than you thought. I called Marcus the next day. I told him about the letter. I told him I wasn't going to do anything with the barn events idea, and that the Thursday Pottery Cooperative was going to keep their Thursday studio, and that I was going to stay in Charlottesville for the time being and run the farm with a part-time farm manager I'd been talking to, someone Grandma Ruth had trusted. He was quiet on the phone in a way that felt different from his usual quiet. He said, "I'm not going to pretend I handled this well." I said, "I know." He said, "She tried to tell me. A few years back. I just didn't hear it." I thought about that, about how many things we don't hear until we can't anymore. About how Grandma Ruth had probably said things to Marcus across 100 dinners and Sunday phone calls that he had processed as small talk and she had intended as something else. About how she'd known the difference between people who listen and people who hear, and she'd spent her whole life being one of the second kind. I didn't say any of this to Marcus. It wasn't the moment. I just said, "Come out in the spring. When the market season starts, I'll put you to work." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said, "Yeah, maybe I will." The first Thursday after the transfer, 6 women showed up at the studio door at 9 in the morning with their clay bags and their thermoses and their comfortable shoes. The oldest was 73. The youngest was 38. I had put out extra stools and unlocked the kiln room and turned on the space heater in the corner because March in Central Virginia is still cold in the mornings. One of them, her name was Dolores, and she had been in the group since Grandma Ruth founded it, stopped at the door and looked at me with the kind of look that contains an entire conversation, and she just said, "She picked right." I didn't know what to do with that except nod and let them in. I didn't work alongside them that first morning. I had things to do, farm things, paperwork things, the ordinary relentlessness of a life that has just been handed to you and needs tending. But I left the studio door cracked, and I could hear them talking and laughing and the wet sound of clay being shaped, and I thought, this is what she was building. Not the barn, not the contracts, not the commercial kitchen license. This. The particular texture of a Thursday morning in a room full of women making things. She knew I would understand that. She knew Marcus wouldn't, not yet, maybe not ever, and she had written her whole plan around that difference. Quietly, the way she did everything, and waited to see if she was right. She was right. She was almost always right. There is something I have not told anyone except my closest friend, and I am telling it now because I think it is the actual heart of what I want to say. I could have made it harder for Marcus. After the transfer, I had legal standing to renegotiate his involvement entirely, to close off access to the property, to formalize everything in ways that would have made the distance between us permanent. He had, after all, walked through that farmhouse looking at the shelves like a liquidation catalog. He had talked about pivoting the pottery studio. He had called the farm a business asset to my face. I had every justification, but I thought about what Grandma Ruth had actually done. She hadn't cut Marcus out. She had given him a door and stood back to see if he would walk through it. She had designed a test not to punish failure but to reveal character, his, and also mine. Because the codicil wasn't only a test of whether Marcus could show up, it was a test of what I would do when I had the power. I think she knew what I would do. I think that was the other reason she left me the farm. Not because I was better than Marcus, because I was the one most likely to hold it for everyone, for the Thursday women, for the cooperative, for the South Field, for whoever comes after me, because I had learned from her that the point of having something is not what it gives you. The point of having something is what you do with it for other people. The land doesn't care about your feelings, she used to say. It only cares whether you showed up. I showed up. I will keep showing up. That's the inheritance. That's the whole thing.